A black family walks into a luxury hotel, only to be told they don't belong. What the staff didn't know. The O'Neills weren't checking in. They already owned the building. In a world built to exclude them, they didn't just claim space, they rewrote the rules. Because legacy isn't bought. It's built. Brick by brick, bias by bias, truth by truth. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. When the O'Neills entered the hotel they now owned, the world outside didn't stop to notice. The morning sun had risen the same way it always did, casting long golden shafts through the city's glass towers, spilling down onto car roofs and coffee carts. But for Shaquille O'Neal, big Shaq to the world, just Shaq to the people who mattered, it was a different kind of morning. It wasn't about press releases or ribbon cuttings. It was about walking into a place that once might have quietly closed its doors to people like him. Today, those doors opened automatically at his presence, but not without resistance from the air itself. The hotel was a towering structure of steel, marble, and carefully measured elegance. Inside, the lobby stretched with intimidating perfection. Spotless cream floors, glassy black columns, and chandeliers that dangled like frozen fireworks. There were no fingerprints on the counters, no creases in the leather chairs. Every line was straight, every whisper was folded in velvet. But beneath the polished calm was something else, a quiet, curated coldness, the kind you can't quite name, but feel settle in your bones. Shaq didn't flinch at the grandeur. He had seen wealth in every form. But this place? This place was legacy waiting to be rewritten, and not just by him. Lucille O'Neal stepped in behind him. Her posture carried the years, both the struggle and the strength. There was grace in her gait, wisdom in her stillness. She didn't need to speak. Her presence made its own kind of noise. Next came Shawnee, elegant and composed. There was no need for performance. Her eyes moved with precision, scanning the space not in wonder, but in calculation. She had been here before, not this building, but this type of place. The kind that says you're welcome but questions why you came in through the front. Beside her was Miara, tall for her age but quiet for the moment, absorbing it all. Her curiosity was matched only by a subtle wariness, the kind born from seeing smiles that didn't always mean kindness. She didn't tug at her mother's hand, but she stayed close enough to feel it. They didn't arrive with a camera crew. They didn't need an entourage. They came with lineage, memory, and legal ownership in hand. But none of that mattered to the walls or the eyes behind the front desk. There were no cheers. No staff lined up with champagne or bouquets. Just a single employee behind the reception counter, standing stiff in a dark suit that matched his expression. His nameplate was polished, his posture even more so. He didn't recognize them or pretended not to. Either way, his nod lacked sincerity. His smile, if it could be called that, stopped at the corners of his lips. Shaq didn't announce himself. He didn't walk like a man demanding attention. He walked like a man who already had it. His strides were steady, unhurried. His hands were relaxed but not casual. Every part of him said, "I belong here." Not loudly, simply, irrefutably. And still, the atmosphere felt off. Not hostile, exactly, just calibrated. Controlled. It was as if the building had learned to tolerate change, but hadn't yet learned how to welcome it. A bellhop crossed the floor with a cart, eyes flickering toward the family, then quickly away. A manager spoke into his earpiece as they passed, lowering his voice as he glanced sideways. Nothing dramatic, nothing said aloud, but silence has volume when you know what to listen for. Shawnee noticed first, a subtle stiffening in the staff's movements, a delay in acknowledgement. Lucille saw it too, but said nothing. She had been raised on silences like these, the kind where dignity meets doubt. She tightened the scarf around her shoulders, as if shielding herself not from cold, but from something more familiar. Miara looked up at her father and asked nothing. She didn't have to. Her eyes asked it all. Shaq stopped at the center of the lobby, turned slowly, and let his gaze settle across the space. He had played in arenas bigger than this, been in rooms louder than this, but never had he felt a silence so pointed. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. This was supposed to be the start of something, a new chapter, a symbol of success not just measured in money, but in meaning. A black family owning a landmark hotel in the heart of a city that once ignored them. This wasn't about ego, it was about space, taking it, holding it, redefining it. A marble plaque on the wall displayed the hotel's name in brass lettering, the Alabaster. Underneath, a quote etched in delicate script read, "Luxury is a feeling." Shaq almost smiled at that. Because feelings, he knew, were not easily faked. And right now, the feeling in this lobby wasn't luxury. It was doubt, restrained, but real. Still, he didn't stop moving forward. The family continued toward the front desk. The manager behind it had already begun typing, his fingers striking the keys a little too hard, a little too fast. He wasn't looking for a reservation. He was looking for an excuse. Shaq caught the gesture. So did Shawnee. And Lucille. They exchanged no words, but their shared glance was enough. They had stepped into ownership, but not acceptance. And that, they all understood, was going to be earned, not just for themselves, but for everyone who'd been told places like this weren't meant for them. They didn't just carry luggage. They carried expectation. They carried memory. They carried the quiet, brilliant pressure of history, and the burden to make this building mean something more than glass, linen, and quiet violins humming through hidden speakers. The O'Neills didn't need to be seen. They came to be remembered. And the lobby? It was about to learn what legacy really looked like when it walked in through the front door. But the lobby didn't welcome them. The chill didn't come from the air. It came from posture, glances, and the spaces between words. The kind of chill that isn't felt on the skin, but somewhere deeper. Behind the polished reception desk stood a man in a fitted gray suit, his hair combed to perfection, his name tag gleaming with calculated shine. His name was Thomas. He didn't glance up immediately, and when he finally did, it was the kind of glance that measures rather than greets. He paused mid-keystroke, as if what stood before him couldn't possibly match what was on the system. He saw them. He just didn't like what he saw. Lucille had noticed it first, the way his eyes moved past her as though she hadn't stepped forward. Shawnee noticed next how his smile flickered on but never spread to the eyes. Miara caught it too. She looked to her mother, who simply gave her a gentle nod. No words. Just a code. Keep walking. Shaq, calm as ever, stepped forward and stopped squarely in front of the desk. He didn't speak right away. He was a man used to being recognized. Not for the fame, but for the presence. The room usually responded to him before he spoke. But not this room. Not today. Thomas looked up at him and said, almost automatically, "We're fully booked for today. I'm afraid there are no suites available at this time." There was no glance at a screen, no check of the system, just a statement. Polished, packaged, and flat. Shawnee's expression didn't change, but her hand instinctively tightened around Miara's shoulder. Lucille raised her chin just slightly, catching the scent of something she'd known all her life, quiet refusal. Shaq remained composed. "We're not here to check in," he said simply. But Thomas interrupted, voice firm but falsely polite. "Reservations are only accepted with pre-approval. I'll have to ask you to verify your details. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." There hadn't been one. Not on their part, at least. Shaq gently gestured to Lucille, who stepped forward with a neatly folded set of documents. Legal, clean, and final. Thomas didn't take them. Instead, he glanced at the family again, as if waiting for them to correct themselves, to admit some confusion, to apologize for their presence. When none of that happened, he let out a shallow breath and finally pretended to glance at the screen, fingers tapping keys with mechanical rhythm. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time without even looking up, "but I have no record of any ownership transfer. I suggest you take this up with management." "Which we are," Lucille said gently. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. But Thomas kept going. "This hotel has very strict standards," he said, with that careful corporate cadence, "and I can't allow disruptions in our lobby. I'd appreciate it if you found another location to settle your concerns." That word disruptions landed with the weight of 1,000 assumptions. Shaq's silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. He was listening, not just to Thomas, but to the movements around them. The bellhop who paused with his cart to stare. The 2 employees at the concierge desk who were whispering. The security guard by the main entrance, who had begun to edge forward, not aggressively but attentively. It was the kind of attention black families are used to in places with too much glass and too little grace. Miara leaned against her mother. She didn't fully understand the politics unfolding, but she understood discomfort. She felt the shift. She knew the room wasn't for them, even though the deed said it was. Thomas straightened his jacket, preparing to move on to the next task, already assuming this encounter was over. But Shaq wasn't leaving, not without making something crystal clear. He reached for his phone, not angrily, not even as a threat, just an action, and even that changed the tone. Thomas's eyes followed the gesture with subtle alarm. Within moments, Shaq was speaking to their attorney. Calm, firm, direct. "Michael, we're at the front desk. It seems the staff is unaware of the transfer. Would you mind joining us in the lobby?" There was a pause in the air, a tension that thickened. Thomas shifted, suddenly less sure of himself. Behind him, one of the other staff members leaned in to whisper something. barely audible but clearly unpleasant. "Did you hear what they're claiming?" The smirk that followed came too quickly, too freely, and Shawnee saw it all. Lucille didn't raise her voice, but her eyes were iron. She had lived through enough years, enough rooms like this, to know when something ugly was hiding behind manners. Then the elevator pinged. Michael entered the lobby, sharp and efficient, briefcase in hand. He crossed the floor without hesitation, nodding to the O'Neills, then facing Thomas with all the calm of a man holding unshakable facts. "Here are the transfer documents. As of this morning, ownership of the Alabaster Hotel now belongs to Mr. Shaquille O'Neal and family. I suggest you update your internal systems." Thomas took the papers reluctantly. His expression dropped just enough to betray him. The power shift wasn't subtle. It was seismic. Around them, the mood changed. The concierge stopped whispering. The bellhop disappeared down a hallway. Even the security guard turned away, suddenly absorbed in something on his earpiece. The hotel, which had tried to resist their presence, was now adjusting itself, not by will, by force of truth. Thomas fumbled for recovery. Of course. There must have been a delay in internal communication. "Please accept my apology. Allow me to escort you to your suite." But the damage had been done. The suite wasn't just a room anymore. It was a statement. Shaq didn't gloat. He nodded once and motioned for his family to follow. They moved together. Lucille calm, Shawnee composed, Miara still silent but observant. They didn't walk in victory. They walked in confirmation. Because what they had felt in that lobby wasn't new. It was an echo of every time someone like them was told, "Maybe you're in the wrong place." But this time, they weren't. They were exactly where they belonged. Big Shaq didn't raise his voice. He never had to. His presence alone could hush a room, but today he used it differently. Today, it wasn't about commanding space. It was about holding it, anchoring his family in a moment that threatened to unravel what they had built. He told the truth, steady and unshaken. They weren't guests. They were owners. Not investors, not sponsors. Owners. But the words didn't land. The staff behind the desk didn't blink. One of them, a younger employee with slicked back hair and the kind of arrogance that comes from never being challenged, let out a half laugh under his breath. He leaned toward his colleague and whispered something sharp, juvenile, but loud enough to carry. The kind of comment designed to sting, to provoke, something about surprise guests and back entrances. Lucille heard it. She didn't flinch. Her entire life had been shaped by words like those, hurled in polished lobbies, on courthouse steps, through clenched teeth and closed doors. She had learned, long ago, that some insults come with smiles, and some with silence, but all with intent. Shawnee heard it too. She didn't speak. Her glance was enough, directed not at the whispering employee, but at the others who remained still, complicit through silence. It was always the silence that stung deeper than the words. Even Miara, still a teenager but not blind, caught the shift. She had entered the hotel with wide eyes and open energy. Now she stood closer to her mother, spine straighter, expression harder. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. The air wasn't cold. The attitudes were. Michael, the lawyer, handed over the documents. They were crisp and final, with embossed signatures and timestamps. Thomas, the front desk manager, took them with mechanical hands, avoiding eye contact as he scanned them. The proof was irrefutable. Ownership had changed, legally, completely, but still, a weight hung in the air, as though validation wasn't enough, as though truth needed approval to exist. There was no apology, only procedure. "Please follow me," Thomas said stiffly. "We'll get you situated." His voice had lost its earlier arrogance, but not because it had found humility. It had found fear. Fear dressed in professionalism. As they moved toward the elevators, the staff parted in small, reluctant ripples. Some averted their eyes. A few watched with forced neutrality. The smirking employee turned away altogether, jaw tight. Not because he was ashamed, but because he had been caught wrong. The difference mattered. Inside the elevator, mirrors lined the walls, throwing reflections in every direction. Shaq looked at his family. Miara was quiet. Lucille stood tall, hands folded in front of her like a statue carved by time. Shawnee looked ahead, expression calm but unreadable. No one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with memory, pride, and something else, a decision forming beneath the surface. When the elevator doors opened to the top floor, the suite awaited with all the expected opulence. Panoramic views of the city stretched out beyond ceiling-high windows. Crystal fixtures glittered from above. Everything was in place, the right color, the right texture, the right temperature. But what the suite couldn't hide was that it hadn't been prepared for them. The welcome was missing. The anticipation, the effort. This was not a gesture of respect. It was a reluctant handoff. Shaq walked through the space slowly. He examined the furniture, the decor, the attention to detail. It was luxurious, but sterile, like a trophy case in a room that hadn't decided whether to honor or hide the past. He turned to Lucille, whose gaze wandered toward the balcony. "It's beautiful," she said finally, not because she believed it entirely, but because she understood what it meant to claim the space, even if the space had tried to resist them. Shawnee began to unpack with quiet precision. Not just clothes, but resolve. She opened drawers like someone mapping out new territory. Not because she needed it to feel like home, but because she wanted it to become one. A statement. A reset. Miira wandered to the window and stood in the light. For a moment, her reflection disappeared behind the view. And maybe that's what the world had always wanted, for people like her to vanish behind glass instead of standing in front of it. But not anymore. Shaq stepped out onto the balcony. The wind was sharp but clear. The noise of the city pulsed far below, distant but present. He let the silence wash over him. Not because he was at peace, but because he was planning the next move. This wasn't a victory yet. It was a moment, a tension point. The kind where legacies are tested, not just claimed. Back inside, the hotel intercom buzzed. A voice, mechanical, professional, cool, requested confirmation of occupancy. Shawnee responded without hesitation, listing their names and titles as owners. There was a pause on the line, then a short, clipped response. "Understood. Welcome." No warmth, just acknowledgement. The O'Neills didn't need warmth. They needed honesty. Later that afternoon, Shaq called a private meeting with Michael. No staff were present. No performance. Just a discussion about policy, personnel files, and expectations, not revenge. Reform. The lobby encounter wasn't going to be left behind. It was going to be addressed. That evening, before dinner, Lucille stood by the front windows and watched the sunset fall over the skyline. She had been part of a different era, one where people had to smile while being denied service, where ownership was a dream whispered behind closed doors. She watched her son now, standing where history had once drawn the line, and stepping over it. Shaq knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the start. The friction wasn't over. The culture of this place had roots, and roots don't leave quietly. But he also knew what kind of soil he brought with him. Fertile, focused, unshakable. Tomorrow, they'd address the staff, but tonight they reclaimed silence as peace, not suppression. The walls might still whisper, but from now on, the O'Neills were the ones writing what echoed back. The manager's tone turned from smug to rattled the moment Shaq made that call. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened or demanded. Just a quiet conversation with someone who had power of a different kind. Power not worn on the skin but stamped in ink, filed in archives and backed by law. A phone call placed without drama, but with finality. Minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and Michael Shaw stepped out in a fitted navy suit that looked as pressed as his words. He didn't rush. He didn't pause. He walked with purpose. The kind that comes when you know your job isn't to argue, it's to confirm. The soft echo of his shoes across the marble lobby was the only sound cutting through the thick discomfort. "Thomas." The manager spotted him instantly and straightened his posture like a man trying to reset time. He stepped forward with a tight smile, but the charm had drained from his face. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier now clung to the edges of his professionalism, strained and paper-thin. Michael didn't stop to chat. He opened his briefcase smoothly and handed over the documents with practiced precision. "Effective as of 7 a.m. today," he said clearly. "This hotel is legally under the ownership of Mr. Shaquille O'Neal and his family. Please update your system accordingly." Thomas took the papers slowly. The weight of them wasn't physical. It was moral, irrefutable. Notarized signatures gleamed beneath the heading. Transfer of title and full management rights. The kind of paperwork that doesn't beg to be believed. It requires it. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with realization. A staff member at the concierge desk dropped his pen. A bellhop froze mid-stride, his cartwheels creaking awkwardly in the quiet. Even the floral arrangements looked suddenly out of place, too delicate in a room where truth had just shattered the performance. Thomas glanced at the papers, then at Shaq, then at Lucille, who met his gaze with the unwavering stillness of someone who'd seen much worse and survived it all. She didn't blink, she didn't smile, she didn't need to. "I see," Thomas finally said, the syllables sticking. "This must have been a communication oversight. My apologies, we weren't informed." His words fumbled out in a rush, tripping over themselves in a desperate attempt to rewind the past 10 minutes. But the moment had already branded itself into the room. Shawnee folded her arms slowly, her expression cool but watchful. Miara stood beside her, no longer uncertain, but solid, a witness to her family's grace under fire. This wasn't a lecture, it was a live lesson. Shaq nodded once. Then let's move forward. Thomas hesitated before responding. Then, with a strained attempt at courtesy, gestured toward the elevators. I'll escort you to the executive suite myself. It's our finest room. Of course it was, now that it belonged to them. As they moved across the lobby once more, something had changed. Not just the shift in tone, not just the glances that followed their steps. It was in the air. The same staff who had mocked and questioned now pulled back. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered awkward smiles, late and hollow. No one said the words, but the entire space echoed with them. They were wrong, and they knew it. Thomas walked slightly ahead, his stride clipped, his hand tightening around the keycard he now held like a peace offering. The elevator doors opened again. This time, no one looked away. The lobby was watching history correct itself, whether it liked it or not. Inside the elevator, Thomas tried to reassemble his authority, offering a shallow monologue about service standards, luxury priorities, and how the hotel prides itself on maintaining a consistent guest experience. His voice was shaky, his posture rigid. The speech rang like a script meant to distract from what had just unfolded. Lucille finally spoke, just one sentence. If that's true, then consistency needs redefinition. She said it without sharpness but with weight, the kind that turns a statement into a verdict. Thomas didn't respond. When the doors opened at the top floor, he stepped out first and opened the suite door with practiced formality. The room glowed with soft lighting and expensive restraint, neutral colors, minimalist furniture, sleek glass panels hiding everything behind soft angles. But it wasn't the suite that mattered. It was who stood in it. Thomas handed the keycard to Shaq like someone returning something they never truly owned. If you need anything else, Mr. O'Neill, he said almost too quietly, we'll make sure the staff is aware. Shaq didn't thank him. He simply nodded. Thomas left the suite quickly, shoulders tight, his entire demeanor now a reflection of consequences. His confident stride had shrunk into a retreat. Inside, the suite felt different than it had earlier. Not because it had changed, but because they had claimed it. The tension of the lobby was still lingering, but it was no longer lodged in their bones. It had been turned into fuel. Lucille sat near the window, letting the light fall across her face. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The air was full of everything that hadn't been said, but had been felt by every generation before her. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She simply exhaled, and in that breath was a lifetime. Shawnee stepped into the kitchen alcove, opened a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. Her calm hadn't cracked once, but now she let it settle into something softer. That's one, she murmured under her breath. One moment won, many more to come. Miara wandered to the balcony again. The city hadn't changed, but the view had. She looked down at the lobby entrance, the same doors they had walked through hours ago, the same marble floor, but now she knew what the ground beneath her feet cost to stand on. Shaq stood in the center of the suite, looking around, not with pride, with intent. This wasn't the end of something ugly. It was the beginning of something necessary. Because prejudice never leaves on its own. It has to be shown the door. And now, that door was wide open. They were finally shown the suite, reluctantly, and without the respect it should have carried. No warm welcome, no celebratory gesture, just a handoff, sterile and procedural, as if the staff had fulfilled an obligation rather than honored a reality. But Big Shaq didn't take offense. He took notes. Inside, the suite glistened with curated luxury, polished hardwood beneath Italian rugs, a wall of glass overlooking the city's skyline, and furnishings that whispered sophistication in tones of beige and silver. Everything looked flawless, but it felt unfinished, not because it lacked amenities, but because it lacked sincerity. The room had been prepared with money, but not with care. Shaq walked through slowly, inspecting the layout, the details, the choices. His mind wasn't occupied with surface value. He was thinking deeper, about who this room had once been intended for, and who it had not. He understood this place had been designed to impress a specific kind of guest. What he questioned now was whether it could be reshaped to reflect something broader, something braver. As the afternoon sun began its descent, warm gold light spilled across the living room floor, casting long shadows that crept up the wall like history reaching into the present. Lucille stood near the window, unmoving. Her silhouette, outlined by fading light, looked like something eternal, dignity carved into time. She didn't need to speak. Her silence filled the space more profoundly than any speech. She had witnessed too many moments where injustice wore a tie and used manners as armor. This time she was in the center of the room, not pushed to its edges, and yet she carried the restraint of someone who had earned her seat but still had to prove it meant something. Shawnee moved to the kitchen island, her fingers trailing lightly across the cold marble. The expression on her face was calm, but her thoughts moved quickly beneath it. She wasn't wondering if they belonged here. She was thinking about how to make this space speak, how to leave behind more than footprints on carpet. She was already designing new energy, not for herself, but for the people who would come after. Miara unpacked in the bedroom slowly. She placed her journal on the nightstand, aligned her shoes under the bench, and then stood still for a moment, her eyes landing on the framed photograph hung above the bed, a faceless figure sipping wine on a balcony, opulence without identity. She stared at it, unblinking, wondering what kind of person the room had been expecting. Then, without a word, she pulled the frame down and leaned it against the wall. She wasn't erasing anything. She was making space for something real. That evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one below them, the family sat together in the common room. No television, no music, just quiet conversation. But not about what had happened. Not about Thomas. Not about humiliation. Those were surface-level distractions. They discussed culture, the kind that can't be bought, only lived. What they'd encountered wasn't surprising. It was old, predictable. But that didn't mean it should be tolerated. What struck them deeper wasn't the resistance. It was how institutional it had become. How easily a team of trained professionals had smirked, shrugged, and dismissed truth when it didn't match their comfort. And how fragile that confidence became when confronted by proof. They hadn't come just to own a hotel. They had come to transform it. Not with slogans or renovations. With presence. With standards rooted in something stronger than customer service. With values that couldn't be taught from manuals, but from moments. With leadership that walked the lobby, not just to oversee, but to see. Shaq spoke little during that evening. He listened more. He watched his daughter speak her truth. Her words thoughtful. Her voice still growing but already strong. He heard his wife outline the kind of environment she believed in. One where guests didn't have to decode whether their welcome was real. He looked at his mother, whose silence was agreement, whose presence was a kind of testimony that needed no explanation. Later that night, he stood on the balcony alone. The city spread out beneath him, glittering, restless, beautiful in its contradictions. He looked down at the front entrance of the hotel, the same path they had walked earlier that day, the same marble floors, the same doors that had tried to decide who they were. He remembered every detail of that moment, but he didn't carry bitterness. He carried plans. This hotel wasn't just going to operate differently. It was going to mean something different. He thought about the guests' families who had been overlooked, couples who had been judged before being greeted, individuals who had tiptoed through luxury, unsure if they were trespassing or welcomed. That would end. Not through press, through policy, through training, through culture that didn't whisper inclusion but insisted on it. The transformation would begin at the source, the staff. Not through discipline, but through confrontation with reality. He would look each person in the eye and make them choose, not sides, values. He wouldn't humiliate anyone. That wasn't who he was. But he would show them the mirror and let the reflection do the rest. He returned inside to find Lucille still awake, seated by the lamp with a photo album in her hands. Not of the past, but of their family's journey. A reminder of where they had come from and how many rooms they had already walked into where they weren't meant to stay. "You ready?" she asked, eyes still on the page. He nodded. "We start tomorrow." She closed the album gently. The suite no longer felt sterile. It felt charged. Outside, the city buzzed. But inside, something deeper moved. Not anger. Not pride. Conviction. The O'Neills weren't just guests in this building. They were the architects of what it would become. By morning, the entire staff had gathered in the conference room. Some arrived early, eager to witness what they thought might be a reckoning. Others trickled in with arms crossed and eyebrows raised, unsure of what they were walking into. A few exchanged quiet glances and murmured speculation. The air was stiff with anticipation, with the kind of tension that floats just above civil silence. No one quite knew what to expect, but they knew who had summoned them. Shaq entered the room first, not to dominate it, but to define it. His walk wasn't loud, but it filled the space. There was no podium, no microphone, just presence. One that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it through stillness. Behind him came Shawnee, composed and resolute, followed by Lucille, steady as a mountain. Miara stood just outside, watching the room fill with adults who would soon learn that the way things had been would not be the way things would stay. There were no prepared slides, no printed agendas. Shaq didn't need props. His message wasn't performative, it was personal, and that's what struck the room first. He didn't speak as an owner. He spoke as someone who had lived through every expression of exclusion, camouflaged in formality. His tone wasn't bitter, it was clear. He didn't talk about operations or revenue. He talked about feeling that a hotel wasn't its fixtures, nor its 5-star rating, but its soul. That what made people return wasn't the linen count but how they were treated when they first walked through the door. That hospitality at its core wasn't about politeness, it was about presence, recognition, respect. He didn't mention names. He didn't call out yesterday's behavior. He didn't need to. The weight of his words was already rearranging the faces in the room. Some shifted in their chairs, eyes down. Others sat forward, listening harder than they had in years. One or two in the back exchanged skeptical glances, the kind that clung to the idea that this was temporary, that the old hierarchy would eventually reassert itself. But the mood had changed, and they felt it. Shawnee stepped forward briefly, reinforcing what had been said not as a corporate mission, but a personal creed, that no guest should ever wonder if their presence was being judged, that excellence meant little if it wasn't extended to everyone. She reminded the room that change wasn't a threat, it was an invitation, and what happened next would show who wanted to belong in the new culture and who was simply clinging to the comfort of the old one. Lucille didn't speak at all, but her silence was strategic. Her presence was enough. She stood near the back, where the skeptical staff had gathered. Every now and then, one of them glanced her way, and each time they did, they looked away faster. Then came the turning point. Shaq introduced a new program, one that would begin immediately. A full audit of employee conduct, hiring practices, and guest treatment logs would be conducted over the next 2 weeks. Every staff member, from top-tier managers to overnight cleaners, would be part of a cultural accountability review, not to punish, but to educate, to unlearn and rebuild. He explained that professional hospitality was no longer just about execution. It was about awareness, emotional intelligence, equity, that anyone unwilling to grow would need to consider whether this hotel was still their place. The silence that followed wasn't resistance, it was reckoning. For the first time, the roles had flipped. The staff were being seen, not just for their uniforms, but for the impact of their behavior. There would be no hiding behind rank. Bias would no longer be explained away as miscommunication or oversight. He laid out expectations clearly. All future hiring would include inclusion training as a baseline. Promotion eligibility would be tied to behavior evaluations, not just performance metrics. A guest experience board, led by community members outside the hotel, would be invited to assess service anonymously, with reports submitted directly to ownership. These weren't threats, they were standards. The meeting ended not with applause, but with awareness. Some employees walked out in silence, processing. Some lingered, quietly nodding. Others left quickly, their pace betraying unease. But a few stayed behind, not to argue, to thank, softly, privately. These were the ones who had long felt the pressure to conform to a culture that didn't sit right. The ones who'd stayed quiet while others mocked, ignored, or excluded. The ones who had long believed in the power of real change but hadn't had the backing to enact it. Now they did. Back in the suite, the family debriefed, not with celebration, but with strategy. Miara asked questions, hard ones. Would people pretend to change just to keep their jobs? Would there be backlash? Would they be isolated as owners who made the place too serious? Lucille smiled softly at her granddaughter's instincts. They were the right questions. They were the reason this work mattered. Shaq knew resistance wouldn't end with a single meeting. He had no illusions about how deeply rooted bias could be in a place that had operated for years under unchecked habits. But he also knew the first crack had been made, the kind that spreads quietly, steadily. The hotel wouldn't shift overnight. There would be days when things slipped, when someone forgot, when someone tested the limits. But the difference now was that the line had been drawn, and for the first time that line was being enforced not by fear, but by vision. Down in the lobby, the mood was already changing. The front desk staff were speaking more carefully. The housekeeping supervisors huddled in tighter groups, their voices lower but their eyes more alert. Word had spread. The O'Neills weren't temporary, they weren't passive, and they weren't just owners. They were here to reset the compass. Not with threats, with truth. Not with blame, with responsibility. And as the sun rose higher through the glass atrium, a hotel that had once survived on exclusion began, finally, to redefine luxury, not by what it offered, but by what it refused to ignore. Some shifted in their stance. Others nodded, finally feeling seen themselves. Not everyone in the room had been part of yesterday's shame, but everyone had a choice about tomorrow. And choices, Shaq said without saying, define people more than titles do. 2 days passed. Not much had changed to the naked eye. The chandeliers still sparkled. The linen remained crisp. The smiles at the concierge desk were as polished as ever. But beneath the gloss there was movement, tension, quiet audits of behavior, side glances that held questions instead of certainty. Everyone in the building knew they were being watched by owners who didn't hover but saw everything. What happened next wasn't staged. It came at 11:43 a.m. on a Friday. The lobby buzzed with guests checking in, staff directing luggage, bellhops weaving between columns. Shawnee was in the hallway near the private elevator, reviewing vendor contracts. Lucille sat quietly in a velvet chair near the fireplace, sipping tea and observing. Shaq had just stepped off a call with a charity partner when it happened. A young couple entered the hotel, well-dressed, with calm energy, expecting nothing but what they had paid for. But their arrival stirred a ripple. The woman, darker-skinned, held a reservation. The man, lighter, but clearly her partner, pushed their suitcase with a casual ease. They approached the front desk, unaware of the shift forming behind it. The clerk on duty was someone new. One of the last holdouts from the old culture. His posture changed. His smile faltered. He leaned toward his monitor with manufactured scrutiny. The couple stood patiently. The woman offered her name again, gently correcting his mispronunciation. He repeated it louder, deliberately wrong. Lucille heard it from across the room. Shawnee looked up immediately. A pause followed. Then the clerk announced that the reservation had been cancelled due to an error in the payment system. His tone didn't ask for understanding. It offered none. The woman blinked. She explained, calmly, that she had the confirmation email. She pulled out her phone, showed him the receipt. He didn't look. Instead, he offered a tight shrug. "You'll have to call customer service," he said flatly. "There's nothing I can do here." By then, the lobby had quieted. Not completely, but noticeably. People were listening, watching, not all with concern. Some with anticipation, others with quiet hope. They had seen this dance before. Shawnee moved first. She crossed the floor swiftly, her expression composed but unreadable. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked over and stood beside the couple, then turned slowly to face the clerk. The man at the desk flinched. Not because he was in trouble, but because he knew he had stepped into a moment larger than policy. Shaq approached next. His presence didn't need an introduction. It was already doing the work. Guests nearby began whispering, backing up, giving space to the unfolding scene. Lucille remained seated, watching, always watching. Shaq didn't ask questions. He simply took the woman's phone, examined the confirmation, and placed it gently on the counter. Then, without looking at the clerk, he asked for the front desk manager. Calm, final. A beat passed. The clerk hesitated. Then, over the intercom, a soft chime echoed through the lobby. The manager emerged from the back, an older gentleman recently hired, neutral in expression but swift in action. He took one look at the screen, nodded, and confirmed that the reservation was valid. The system had been overridden. There was no error. The couple was offered a room upgrade. Apologies were extended, but it was too late for courtesy to cover the truth. The damage had been done, and everyone had seen it. Shaq turned to the clerk, not with anger, with clarity. "You made a choice," he said simply. The words didn't hang in the air. They carved it. The clerk opened his mouth, but no words came. Not because he was silenced, but because there was nothing left to defend. Shawnee stepped in. She addressed the guests first, thanking them for their patience, ensuring they were escorted personally to their suite, and offering them a dining credit on behalf of ownership. The woman smiled, not because she had been appeased, but because she had been defended. Her dignity had been acknowledged, publicly. That mattered more than any suite upgrade. The clerk was removed from the desk quietly. No scene, no shouting, just accountability. Later that day, a second staff meeting was called. Shaq stood before them again. But this time, the atmosphere had changed. The excuses had evaporated. There was no space left to hide behind systems or misunderstandings. What had been theoretical days ago had become real. He spoke about responsibility, about power, not as a possession, but as a burden. About how every job, no matter how small, was a moment of impact. That hotels, like people, are judged by their hardest moments, not their easiest ones. He didn't point fingers. He held up a mirror. Shawnee followed him, outlining new conflict escalation protocols, reinforced by real consequences. Lucille stood at the back again. She didn't speak. But she nodded once when it was clear that no one would ever be allowed to repeat what had just happened without response. Some staff looked shaken. Others looked energized. Change always splits a room. But now the line was clearer than ever. The O'Neills had arrived days ago as owners. Now, they were something more. They were protectors of culture. And culture doesn't whisper. It acts. Weeks later, the hotel lobby hadn't changed much in appearance. The marble floors were still pristine. The chandelier still refracted morning light into a kaleidoscope of quiet glamour. The floral arrangements were refreshed daily, and the signature scent, a subtle blend of sandalwood and citrus, still floated softly through the air. But you could feel the difference. It was in the way the concierge greeted each guest with sincerity, not script. In how the bellhops asked questions beyond how many bags and actually listened to the answers. In the lobby cafe, where staff now recognized returning guests and remembered details that made people feel less like customers and more like community. It wasn't just better service. It was a better spirit. Where once the room had felt rehearsed, now it felt responsive, alive. There was a quiet rhythm to the place, built not on fear or policy, but on presence. Guests lingered longer. Families took photos near the glass panels, not because the space looked expensive, but because it finally felt welcoming. A woman reading in the corner lounge no longer looked over her shoulder when staff passed. A father checking in with his children beside him didn't instinctively tighten his posture. People breathed easier, smiled quicker, trusted more. And none of it had been achieved through spectacle. There were no press conferences, no viral campaigns, just consistency, just truth repeated in small acts, just leadership that didn't perform its values but lived them. When Big Shaq walked through the lobby one late afternoon with Lucille, Shawnee and Miara at his side, he wasn't met with gasps or stares. He was met with posture. People stood a little straighter, not out of fear, but out of respect. It wasn't about celebrity. It was about clarity. His presence was no longer a surprise. It was a reminder that this place had changed and stayed that way. The front desk staff greeted them by name, but not with the shallow cheer of hospitality training. Their smiles reached their eyes. One of them, an employee who had once stood frozen during the earliest confrontation, now offered the suite keys before being asked, not to please, to honor. Because ownership wasn't just about property here. It was about what the space now represented. Lucille walked beside her son, her stride steady, her shoulders relaxed. She no longer scanned the room with guarded skepticism. She took it in with quiet affirmation. The walls didn't whisper resistance anymore. They hummed acknowledgement. Shawnee paused at a sculpture in the corner, one of the newer additions curated by a local artist. It was abstract but unmistakable, interlocking figures rising from a single base, hands open, faces undefined. Growth made visible. It hadn't been chosen for style. It had been chosen because it meant something. Guests often asked about it. Some stood before it and simply stared. A few took selfies, but all of them felt its presence. Mira made her way to the cafe. The barista, a young man with bright eyes and a soft demeanor, had already started making her usual before she reached the counter. She smiled, not just for the familiarity, but because she remembered how invisible she had once felt here. Now, she was part of the fabric. Upstairs, the management office had evolved. The mood had changed. Walls that once held certificates and charts now featured photographs of staff volunteering together, attending equity workshops and candid shots of guests laughing in common spaces. One photo, taken without fanfare, showed Lucille handing a flower to a child whose family had arrived late one evening after a delayed flight. That photo had become something of a symbol, not just of kindness, but of the new rules, unwritten but undeniable. There were still challenges. Not every guest carried goodwill. There were moments where old habits resurfaced, but the difference now was response. The staff were empowered, supported, held to standards that were not just about performance, but about presence. They knew the line, and they knew who stood behind it. A new training officer had been hired, an Afro-Latina woman with decades in hospitality, known for bridging excellence and empathy. She ran orientation now, starting each session not with slides but with a single question. What does it mean to welcome someone? The answers weren't always right, but they were honest. That was the point. Growth had become practice. Outside, the city still moved fast. But within these walls, time felt just a little slower. Just long enough to notice people, to make them feel seen. And in that attention, the hotel found its edge. Not in luxury, but in intentionality. That evening, the O'Neills met in the top floor lounge, not for business, but for something quieter. Reflection. They didn't need to say much. They looked around at the place they had once walked into as owners with everything to prove. Now they didn't need to prove anything. The hotel had spoken for them. Lucille looked out over the city lights, her hands folded in her lap, her breath slow and full. She didn't need to tell the story. She had lived it. Shawnee sat beside her, her planner closed for once, her mind not on logistics or oversight, but on something deeper, permanence. The feeling that this wasn't just a good season, but a new foundation. Mira leaned on the railing nearby, earbuds in, but eyes open. She wasn't taking a break, she was taking it all in. The mood, the stillness, the legacy. Shaq stood with his hands in his pockets, silent, content, not because the journey was easy, but because it was theirs, and because every guest walking through that front door now walked into more than a building. They walked into a promise. This wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a home for anyone who needed to be reminded they mattered. They weren't just owners. They were architects of change. And the building would remember them long after the last key card was handed out, long after the lights dimmed each night. Because change doesn't fade. It settles in the walls. And stays. If this story stirred something in you, it's because truth echoes louder than silence. We don't just tell stories, we build spaces where they matter. Because representation isn't a trend. It's a foundation. Stay with us. Stand with us. The doors are open, and we're not leaving them the way we found them. The manager didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew his place had changed, and now he'd have to earn the space he stood in. The title on his nameplate no longer guaranteed authority. It demanded accountability. Where once his presence in the room had silenced others, now it was met with quiet observation. People were watching him differently, not with fear or deference, but with expectation. The shift didn't come as a single sweeping gesture. It unfolded in layers, subtle, firm, undeniable. Policies were reworded, orientation scripts were revised, but the deeper change lived in the everyday moments, the tiny cracks in the culture that were now being carefully filled. It began at the front desk. The smiles became real. Eye contact was no longer withheld. It was offered, not in forced politeness, but in human acknowledgement. Guests entering the lobby were greeted not with suspicion, but with intention. Staff leaned in when spoken to. They asked names, not room numbers first, and they listened. It wasn't performative, it was practiced. And slowly, it became habit. Housekeeping teams, once rarely seen, were now involved in weekly meetings led by new training staff brought in from inclusive hospitality organizations. Not consultants in suits, but former hotel workers who spoke from lived experience. Their stories of erasure, of quiet disrespect, of being invisible unless something went wrong, brought clarity. There were no lectures, only shared truths. And those truths echoed louder than any corporate seminar ever could. Shawnee oversaw the implementation directly. She didn't delegate the culture work. She walked the hallways during shift transitions. She sat in on training sessions, asked the hard questions, and stayed afterward to answer the even harder ones. Her presence alone said it all. This change wasn't optional. It was personal. She remembered names. She noticed tone. She knew who leaned in and who rolled their eyes. The staff learned quickly. She didn't miss much. Lucille became a quiet fixture in the hotel's common areas. Not a supervisor, a presence. Guests often mistook her for someone on the board. And in a way she was. She was the moral compass of the building. Employees who once dismissed her now stopped by to speak. Some offered updates. Some simply nodded. But every interaction added to a growing understanding. This place was under new principles, not just new management. Even the physical space began to respond. Brochures changed. Artwork once chosen for aesthetic neutrality was replaced with pieces that told real stories. Portraits from diverse artists, photographs of communities, subtle visual affirmations that every kind of person belonged here. A new sign was installed near the lobby entrance. Hospitality is how we say. We see you. No branding, no hashtags, just truth. Miara noticed the difference most sharply. At first she had kept a distance, unsure how much to trust the performance of transformation. But over time she began walking the halls alone. Not because she felt braver, but because the hotel felt safer. Not perfect, but changed. She passed staff who now offered more than a nod. They asked how her day was. Some even remembered her favorite drink from the lobby cafe. She wasn't a boss's daughter to them anymore. She was Mayara, and they respected that. Shaq, meanwhile, kept his distance just enough to observe the shift without influencing it too directly. He let people grow into the new culture rather than pressure them into it. His presence in meetings was less frequent, but more impactful when it occurred. He appeared in spaces at unexpected times, the laundry room, the parking garage, the break lounge, just to listen, not to inspect, to witness. And in those moments, the staff understood what leadership meant in this new world. It meant being seen when you thought you were invisible. The employee who had once dismissed the young couple at the desk was gone. Not fired. Released. After a choice was offered and ignored. He hadn't resisted because he was wrong. He had resisted because he couldn't imagine being expected to do better. That, more than the mistake, had made him incompatible with the future. In his place came a young woman who had previously worked in housekeeping. She was promoted after supervisors noticed her natural empathy and strong organization. Her appointment wasn't symbolic. It was earned. And when she stood behind the desk and welcomed guests with a calm, confident voice, the entire energy of the lobby shifted with her. Guests began to notice. Reviews started referencing the feeling of the place. Words like warm, genuine, refreshing replaced the usual accolades about thread counts and infinity pools. Word of mouth brought in travelers who didn't just want luxury, they wanted dignity. They wanted to feel seen without being stared at, helped without being handled. And that's what they got. There were still hard days. A guest who made a complaint rooted in bias. A staff member who struggled to unlearn habits formed in silence. But these moments no longer passed unchecked. They were addressed. Not with hostility, but with clarity. The hotel had built a system that didn't just absorb harm, it responded to it. Back in the suite, the O'Neills began settling into a different rhythm. The initial storm had passed, but they knew the work was not finished. Culture, they understood, was not a task. It was a living thing, one that needed nurturing, one that needed protection. Lucille often reflected in the evenings. She'd sit with a journal she never read aloud from, writing notes about what she saw, names, small acts, patterns. She was the family's unofficial memory keeper, quietly ensuring that what they built wouldn't be lost in comfort. Shawnee began drafting a manual, not just for the hotel but for others who would follow. A guide not for operations, but for transformation, for owners who came after them, for women stepping into spaces designed to ignore them, for daughters like Miara, who would one day ask how change had happened, and would deserve more than vague recollections. And Shaq, he watched it all, not as a savior, not as a figurehead, but as a man who had walked into a place meant to reject him, and left his name in its foundation, not just as an owner, as a lesson, as a reminder that culture is not granted by architecture or accolades. It's revealed in the silence after impact, and what people choose to do with it. And now, more and more, when that silence fell in the Alabaster's lobby, it sounded like peace,